Today, we would like to acknowledge that the work we are about to present and the network we have built relies on the traditional Indigenous territories that offer us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community for our activities, our education, living, and recreation. We recognize that these lands continue to be home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Empowering Indigenous youth in Canada is essential to creating a sustainable future, and it requires engagement approaches that actively involve them in discussions about land use and resource development that will impact their future. By examining successful examples and exploring examples of unsuccessful engagement, we have developed a framework for communications professionals that they can incorporate into their public engagement practices. In this video, we will discuss the success and lessons learned from bridging the gap between formal guidelines and meaningful participation in inclusive stakeholder engagement in land resource development. We will examine Suncor's two-way symmetrical model of public relations, which aims to manage conflict and promote and improve understanding with strategic stakeholders through effective communication. We will look into this dialogue model throughout our framework. We will also include insights from a case study involving the Site C Dam project, where the lack of attention to youth as a key stakeholder resulted in reputational damage and legal challenges, as well as community resistance. This example highlights the importance of addressing cultural, environmental, and legal concerns to prevent negative consequences. Ultimately, we will introduce a structure to support communication professionals in the public, corporate, and environmental sectors that supports relationships in consultation with Indigenous youth. Our project challenges Mitchell, Agile, and Wood's stakeholder salience model and develops a four-pillar framework that involves active participation from Indigenous youth, despite their apparent lack of power, legitimacy, and urgency as defined by stakeholder salience theory.
Case Study A, A Question of Inclusion, BC Hydro's Site C Dam Indigenous Consultation Process. As of 2018, the majority of BC Hydro's consultation was completed, and this case study was designed as a retrospective account. There's a long history of land resource development in Canada, and consultation and engagement for any project must recognize that since Canada's colonization, Indigenous groups have been ignored and silenced. For every new project introduced, Indigenous peoples will remember the past and fear for the future based on their historical experience. In this context, the Peace River has experienced two major hydroelectric projects, the WAC Bennett Dam, completed in 1968, and the Peace Canyon Dam in 1980. In this correspondence quote, the Treaty 8 Tribal Association and the Saulteaux First Nation wanted BC Hydro's assessments to consider the past, current, and future land uses of the affected Indigenous groups. BC Hydro did agree to a limited historical review, but not a future land use assessment. We believe this, along with other failures, was a critical mistake because resentment and distrust is reflected in the correspondence of the affected Indigenous groups and likely created barriers that inhibited future communications. BC Hydro failed to seriously consider how the botched previous hydroelectric projects and rejection of future assessments could damage BC Hydro's reputation and consequently their relationships. As quoted in De Brule et al., BC Hydro could have gone beyond the legal minimum standards of consultation to engage in more meaningful consultation with affected Indigenous people, and as a result, rather than consensus and support for the project, frustrations and conflict have continued to affect its implementation. This case study has shown us that effective strategic communication should begin at consultation and extend beyond the bare minimum because consultation does not equal consent. Case Study B, Suncor's Indigenous Youth Advisory Council. Suncor operates oil sands in northern Alberta, extracting bitumen from the land. It has other sites across Canada focused on exploration, production, extraction, and refining oil. Suncor's Indigenous Youth Advisory Program emphasizes reciprocal relationships between Suncor and Indigenous youth who live in the communities where Suncor operates its land-based mining. This program aims to understand Indigenous communities' needs and priorities through the lens of youth. Suncor engages with these youth in discussions about their work, ensuring that Indigenous voices are included in these critical conversations. As we learned in day 3 of our residency, reputation is based on the views and perceptions of the stakeholder. Suncor's Indigenous Youth Advisory Council demonstrates that action plus communication can equal reputation.
Looking at the 2 case studies, it's very evident that Indigenous youth are a sometimes missing but incredibly valuable stakeholder. While Mitchell, Eggle, and Wood's stakeholder salience model is helpful to identify and categorize stakeholders, we propose that it doesn't include room for communicators to get curious and consider potential stakeholders and groups who could be empowered to achieve legitimacy, power, and/or urgency. In the case of Indigenous youth and resource development and extraction projects, most communicators would likely not categorize them as the quote unquote definitive stakeholder, if only using the stakeholder salience model. This is a missed opportunity. By prioritizing youth and nurturing the stakeholder relationship early, we can become a bridge to supporting their achievement of power, legitimacy, and urgency. And we can integrate their valuable perspectives early on in projects, leading to longer-term success instead of only prioritizing immediate results. This is critical to consider in the case of natural resource development projects, as they often have a long runway and can be ongoing for years. We propose that this curiosity can result in more win-win situations. Indigenous youth achieve meaningful participation in projects that will impact their future selves, and organizations build stronger, more holistic relationships with the groups from whom they seek collaboration and support, leading to less conflict and more opportunities for consensus. We want to highlight that although many organizations and the communicators who support their work are familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, awareness and implementation are not the same thing. Call to Action 92.1 calls on, quote, the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their land and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, the following. Commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects, unquote. So you can see that bringing in Indigenous youth early and often during engagement naturally facilitates alignment for organizations with this very important call to action.
A 4-pillar approach to engaging youth in land resource development. When Indigenous youth are brought into decisions fairly, organizations build credibility, reduce resistance, and gain long-term acceptance from the communities they affect. As Foster 2016 Chapter 4 emphasizes, reputation and legitimacy grow through consistent values-based engagement. We propose a framework that encompasses any or all of the following: early engagement, cultural awareness, co-creation, and non-traditional communication. This framework is not a step model. Instead, it emphasizes pillars for inclusive engagement with Indigenous youth in land resource development. We developed this framework because in many past projects, especially those involving infrastructure and resource development, Indigenous youth have often been excluded from the decision-making process. Planning and infrastructure developments that directly affect their futures have often been made without their voices at the table. But these are not short-term projects. Resource development spans years, sometimes even decades. That means today's youth will be the ones living with the long-term impacts of what is decided now. When they are excluded, it creates resistance, mistrust, and in some cases, legal or reputational consequences for the organizations involved. By not engaging indigenous communities, especially youth, early and meaningfully, we missed the chance to build relationships based on trust and respect. And that often shows up later in the form of public protests, delayed timelines, or media backlash. This is where this model comes in. It is designed as a practical tool for communication professionals. It helps bridge the gap between planning and implementation, particularly in projects involving indigenous communities, land, and resource development. Each of the four pillars offers a structured yet flexible approach to making youth engagement real, not symbolic. It helps ensure that engagement is not just a checkbox, but a thoughtful, culturally grounded, and long-term commitment. Pillar 1, early engagement of indigenous youth. Early engagement is the foundation of meaningful youth inclusion in this process. Too often, indigenous youth are brought in at the end of a project or not at all. But by then, most decisions have already been made, and their input carries less weight. In projects involving indigenous land or resource development, youth from the impacted communities are not just future stakeholders, they are the current ones. They carry deep ties to their ancestral land, often rooted in family, spirituality, and culture. Their knowledge, lived experience, and long-term investment in the land make their voices essential. Engaging youth from the start of a project planning shows respect and value for their participation. It will create trust among them and ensure the decisions made today reflect the values and visions of the people who will live with the consequences tomorrow. This pillar centers around the idea of shifting the attitude from seeing youth as a passive recipients of decisions to recognizing them as active participants and partners in shaping their own futures.
Pillar 2, rooted in local Indigenous culture and traditions. This pillar of the framework emphasizes the integration of Indigenous languages, understanding and adherence to community rules and standards, and the importance of including traditional stories and practices. In Canada, there are more than 600 First Nations communities, which represent more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. This demonstrates that rather than adopting a one-size-fits-all approach to liaising with Indigenous youth, communicators and organizations need to carefully consider the unique facets of the nation and peoples they wish to engage with. If the foundational goal of including Indigenous youth as early stakeholders is to build relational trust, then that goal must be supported by actions that show that we, in our consultative process, are aligned with Indigenous culture and traditions and authentic in our efforts to engage. Boll, Van, Freeman, and Carter, 2013, assert that a lack of culturally appropriate communication can lead to frustration and mistrust, emphasizing just how important this pillar is in engaging with authenticity and a desire to learn.
Pillar 3, co-creating engagement strategies with Indigenous youth. While often seen as aspirational, symmetrical two-way communication, highlighted by Grenag, shows authenticity and helps build trust with the audience. For youth, the values of authenticity and trust are not only preferred, but essential in forming meaningful connections. Similarly, fostering genuine and trusting communication is key to connecting with these audience for their active engagement. Within this framework, we prioritize two-way symmetrical dialogue to foster curiosity and empower youth, thereby developing a more comprehensive understanding of their needs and desires. Our approach challenges Mitchell et al.'s stakeholder salience model by shifting away from Western notions of legitimacy, power, and urgency, and moving beyond this to engagement and beyond a transactional framework. With this in mind, this pillar seen here promotes the idea that in engagements, professionals consulting for land resource development in Canada must view Indigenous youth as true partners. That is, they ought to seek to understand the practical benefits of sharing power through dialogue and co-creation. This pillar is rooted in the belief that Indigenous youth have the right to represent their interest, identify their challenge, and develop their solutions. The role of communications professionals is to support them, learn from them, and share leadership roles. Key to this pillar is that evaluation criteria for consultation should be established through the co-creation of engagement strategies with Indigenous youth and approved with them before the consultation plan is implemented.
Pillar 4, Traditional and Digital Communication. Meet youth where they are. Stakeholders often face geographical and financial barriers to participating in engagement and, according to Site C's consultation correspondence, have experienced inadequate amount of funding provided for them to participate in the consultation process. It can be assumed this would be increasingly true for youth. Reduce infrastructural barriers, acquire funding, sponsorships, and partnerships to support digital access, host video calls, identify social media platforms that are being used by youth, create programs and digital campaigns that involve two-way symmetrical communication, create trust by engaging authentically. The Tamarack Institute suggests to use the language that youth are familiar with. If you don't know what that is, just ask them. Customize digital strategies to each platform. Greenland had great success with a photo elicitation campaign in which young Greenlanders were encouraged to post their photos on Facebook to express their hopes and fears regarding the development of their land resources. Measure and adapt your campaigns. Trends will change over time. When hosting video calls, allow youth to have their screens turned off. Reduce geographical barriers, acquire funding, sponsorships, and partnerships for travel to meetings, hire transportation, meet in schools and other safe places. If you are not sure where those are, ask them. Partner with other organizations that are already engaging youth. Attend community events that your organization is invited to. Join sharing circles. And remember to document and measure these communications as legitimate stakeholder correspondence.
What makes this approach different? This model stands out because it avoids one-size-fits-all thinking. Pilkington 2013 explains the need to segment stakeholders thoughtfully based on power, influence, and interest. Indigenous youth may not always have formal authority, but their lived experience makes them high-interest stakeholders. This model treats them as key players, not an afterthought. Real youth engagement is not just about asking young people to come to a meeting or giving their opinion after decisions have been made. This method is about sharing power and giving young people the chance to make a difference in important ways. It means involving them right from the beginning, so their voices are heard while decisions are made, and do not consider them as mere responders to the decisions already made. We also know that youth leadership takes different forms across communities. It must be based on culture, especially when it comes to Indigenous people, and it must respect traditional languages, ways of knowing, and ways of leading. This strategy depends a lot on communication. We need to meet young people where they are, whether that means using digital tools like online surveys and webinars, or traditional methods like storytelling and ceremony. The real strength comes from blending both approaches. And most importantly, this is not a one-time effort. It involves creating systems and an organizational culture that support youth leadership over time. So it is not just a symbolic model, but a consistent part of how the organization and professionals operate every day with Indigenous communities.
In conclusion, our proposed framework emphasizes the importance of moving beyond one-way and formal guidelines to foster meaningful participation with Indigenous youth as a means of promoting inclusive engagement and land resource development. Our four-pillar framework aims to promote active stakeholder participation, taking into account the varying levels of stakeholder salience and challenging conventional models with more dynamic, inclusive strategies. Integrating these principles can enhance communications, strengthen community relationships, and contribute to sustainable project outcomes. Ultimately, shifting the participation of Indigenous youth from passive recipients to active partners in shaping their future.